thoughts down just to encourage fathers today. I'm not going to have a lot to say, but we will just, I'm going to do my best just to encourage dads today. In 2003 in Somalia, if you remember the news back then, there were some significant, horrific things happening in Somalia. And there was a civil war, and there was many people that were not getting proper needs, food, supplies, resources. And so they decided that the U.S. would fly in with soldiers and kind of do their best to make little pockets of peace and bring resources to those people who were really just desperate and dying because of the lack of it. And so these big helicopters called the Black Hawks would be sweeping over the land, and they'd land, and the soldiers would come, and they would try to bring these resources, much needed resources, to the families and to the people there. But in 2003, when that was all happening, one of these Black Hawk helicopters landed behind enemy territory, trying to make a pocket of peace. But the Somalia soldiers were ready. And as they landed there, they were ambushed, and their helicopter was blown down, and for quite a few days, these soldiers were left in the middle of this war zone with no protection, no one to help them, trying to survive. And actually, it was a movie about 15 years ago called Black Hawk Down. And in that movie, you can see these soldiers basically trapped there, doing their absolute best just to survive. And to me, that's a pretty good picture of fatherhood these days. Because if you want to be a good father, it's not going to be easy. In fact, a lot of the time, it might feel like you're behind enemy lines. Fathers aren't looked upon all that great these days, if you've noticed. If you watch media, they're mostly made fun of. In a lot of the movies, even kids' movies, as we talked about in our family quite often, even Disney movies, you can see that quite early in the movie, the parents are either knocked off early, or at least there might be one left, but there's a struggle of parenthood. And quite often, it's hard to find anywhere in media and movies a good example of a dad. They're the laughing stock, they're the joke, they're the ones that disappear. And in the Bible, when we look at dads, it can be hard to find a good example of a dad in the Bible too. I mean, being a father is a struggle. You're behind enemy lines, and in fact, the enemy doesn't want you to be a good dad. The enemy would love to take out all the dads and see families, because of that, just struggle and crumble. Even in the Bible, it's hard to find a good example of a really good dad. We look at Adam, the first dad. And while he was obviously a significant player in biblical theology and our story, he wasn't that great of a dad. I mean, his son was the first murderer. There was obviously family issues that he wasn't taking care of. Okay, he struggled as a dad. We think of Abraham. We've been talking about Abraham in these last even couple of months in our series in Genesis, and he struggled as a dad. And you might ask, well, no, he didn't. I mean, he loved Isaac. Oh, yeah, he loved Isaac. I mean, he absolutely loved Isaac. And we saw that he loved God more than Isaac, but he certainly loved Isaac. But what about Ishmael? What about his first boy? That was his son. He didn't really have too much to do with Ishmael. In fact, at one point in his life, he kicked him out of the land. He didn't want anything to do with him because of Sarah. It's not a really great dad moment for Abraham. What about Isaac? Isaac struggled as a dad. And he played favorites, and we're going to see that in a couple weeks. He just played favorites, and there were significant issues between his two boys, Isaac and Jacob and Esau. Significant issues. And then we come to Jacob, and I mean, he struggled just as much. He had 12 boys. And there was family conflict constantly because, again, he wasn't that great of a dad. Oh, he loved Benjamin and he loved Joseph, and the other boys knew that very much. That was not a secret to them, and because of that, there were struggles in the family. It's hard finding an example of a really good dad. All the dads we see in the Bible, other than our heavenly dad, they really struggle being a dad. And we can see it in David too. David, the king, he struggled being a dad. And that might shock us a little bit, because that's King David. I mean, he's part of the story. He was even told to be a man after God's own heart. And yet, as a dad, there were struggles. I think there's three things maybe that we can see in the life of David that will just encourage us, either through a bad example or a good one. Dads, I just basically have three things I want you to remember this morning. And we're going to look at David's family situation just to kind of see a little bit about why I would say this. The first thing as a dad you got to do is this. I know the list could go on and on and on and on. I realize that, but I'm only going to give you three. The first thing is this, dads. You got to speak up. You got to speak up. You have to be the one that disciplines your kids. You got to speak into their life these things. You can't let these things undone. Look at 1 Kings 1, verse 6. Now, sir, I don't even have a PowerPoint this morning. Like I said, I jotted a few notes down, thinking that I might have to be preaching this morning, but I don't have a PowerPoint, anything. But we're in 1 Kings 1, verse 6. And in 1 Kings chapter 1, we're introduced to Adonijah, one of David's boys, a little bit older than Absalom. And it says this in verse 6. His father had never rebuked him. You hear that? This is King David. I mean, this is the guy that killed thousands upon thousands, showing justice. Not in his own home. His father had never rebuked him by asking, "Why do you behave as you do? Why do you behave as you do?" He was also very handsome and was born next after Absalom. Well, that's a dangerous combination. A good-looking kid who already thinks he has the whole world wrapped around his finger, who's never told he doesn't. That's a dangerous combination. And we got this young man in this home of a king who the Scripture tells us King David never, ever, ever questioned his behavior. That's a dangerous thing. And there's going to be consequences from that. And in fact, we do see the consequences. Because it wasn't just Adonijah that David didn't discipline. There was sometimes family situations happening that David really was very, very soft on. He never stepped in and spoke up and dealt with them. We see that in 2 Samuel verse 13. In 2 Samuel verse 13, there's this story, actually just earlier in 2 Samuel, there's a story of another one of David's sons, Amnon, who thought his half-sister Tamar was really beautiful. In fact, so much so that he wanted Tamar. He wanted to be with Tamar. And if you know that story, Amnon pretends to be sick to trick Tamar to come and bring him some food to get healthy, and then he pulls her into bed and rapes her. That was King David's son that did this to his half-sister, King David's daughter. And King David doesn't say much about that. He doesn't deal with that as he should. And so his son Absalom thought, if Dad's not going to do it, I will. And he decides that he's going to bring justice. And Absalom kills his brother Amnon. That's significant. That's a murder in the family. That's a murder in King David's house with his own family, his own children. And yet again, King David doesn't really speak up and discipline the boy, make some sort of a significant consequence and bring justice because of that. We see in 2 Samuel 14, verse 33, Joab, who is King David's top of the army, goes to get Absalom just because of this whole situation, he brings Absalom to King David, and we see King David kissing his son. He kissed him. Well, he loved his boy, that's for sure. But didn't love him enough to discipline him and really deal with that situation. He was weak on discipline. He did not do what he needed to do. In Ephesians 6, verse 4, the Bible tells us that fathers need to not exasperate their children. Actually, let's just look at that verse very quickly. Ephesians chapter 6, verse 4. This is in that whole section of family. And God had just talked about husbands and wives, and then he comes into how children need to obey their parents, and then he talks to dads. In Ephesians 6:4, he says, "Fathers, don't exasperate your children. Instead, bring them up in the training and instruction of the Lord." You know how you not exasperate your kids? You know how you not irritate them and bug them? Well, according to God, this is what you do. You teach them what's right. You discipline them. That's how you do that. You have to discipline your kids. And guys, I know sometimes it's easier to let mom do that because they're there all day. And sometimes they have to, and moms do that. But dads need to be the ones to step up and speak up. They need to get beside mom when that happens and say, "This is what happens in my house." Speak up. You have to discipline. Why do we do that? Why do we discipline? Because it's not fun. The kids get mad at us. They slam their doors in their room sometimes when there's consequences laid down. It's because we are worried about their future more than we are our comfort right now. That's why we do it. We are worried more about their future later than our comfort right now. So it's key, dads. It's going to be uncomfortable. Your kids aren't going to really like this. I mean, who likes getting punished? But you do it because dads speak up, and they're the ones that need to discipline. So speak up. Speak up. The second thing I want to say is this: don't just speak up, but show up. Be an example in the life of your kids. It was so great just to even have Gary up here on Father's Day with that prayer request, that praise, saying, "I just thank God for a dad that was an example." Much of what David lived in his life, his boys reflected. You can see that in the pattern of these boys. A lot of boys: Adonijah, Absalom, Solomon. The list goes on. And much of what they reflected in their life was exactly what they saw in their dads. It really wasn't much different. He was a great example later on in his life, absolutely. But when his boys were growing up and he was going to fight wars and being king, he wasn't that great of an example to them. He was non-existent. And that's often where it starts. A couple summers ago, I read 2 books. Well, more than 2 books, but 2 key books. One was called Bringing Up Girls by James Dobson. Because I have one girl and I don't get her. And so I'm trying to figure out, actually, it was one of those days when it was after a conversation I had with my little girl, Bailey, and I just don't get her. I mean, she's emotional and she flies off, and I'm like, what just happened? Where did that come from? And Danielle looked at me and said, "Darren, you're going to have issues with that girl because she's only, I forget, she was like 6 years old or something like that. You're going to have to learn how to deal with this girl, right? Because I know you don't get her, and obviously you're so different. But you got to learn how to deal with this girl." And so I read this book called Bringing Up Girls because I just needed to figure out my girl. How do I get into her head? How do I understand her? How do I care for her better? But I also read a book called Bringing Up Boys. Now, Bringing Up Boys was an older book because he had written that one first, James Dobson from Focus on the Family, and then wrote Bringing Up Girls. But I was reading Bringing Up Boys because I have 3 of those. And so I got like triple the trouble with them. And so one of the stories was about, illustrations was about Mother's Day versus Father's Day. And it was a very interesting kind of story that this prison guard or this prison worker was communicating. I think it was Prison Fellowship went in there on Mother's Day with a whole bunch of Mother's Day cards for the inmates, and they could send their mom a Mother's Day card. And so it was announced to all the inmates, hey, we're doing this card thing for Mother's Day. If you want to send your mom a card, come, and you can write her a card, and we'll get that to your mom, and you can come and participate that. And they ran out of cards because all these inmates are coming to write cards to mom because they just love their mom, and mom was the one. And they thought, this is great. I mean, this is a great way that we can serve these inmates and encourage them and help family things. So he said, on Father's Day, let's do the same thing. On Father's Day, let's do this too. And so the word went out, on Father's Day, we're going to do cards again, guys. Come and write your dad a Father's Day card, and we'll make sure that your dad gets the card. No one came. No one came. What a sad testimony to the lives of many of these men, but what was true. And in fact, what they say, one of the reasons for why many of these guys end up in jail in the first place, they don't have dads. Well, they have dads, but they're non-existent. They are fatherless boys and fatherless men. They don't have an example to look at. They don't have an example to look at and say, that's a man. That's what a man does. And for King David, many of his boys were saying, that's a man in some of David's weakest times, non-existent times, and struggling with a dad that was somewhat non-existent, even in his discipline. We have non-existent dads. We have dads that aren't being that example. But not being that model for their kids. And they desperately need that. Whether you're boys or girls, they need to see what a dad does. For a girl, they just need a dad that's going to hug them and love them no matter what. That's what they need. They need a dad that says, you are beautiful, before any other guy says that. So they know it's true. And they know who said it and why. And for the boys, they need a dad that says, watch me, and I'll show you how to get this done. They need these examples to not just teach your boys to how to change their oil on their cars, right? That's important, and that's good dad-son time, dad-daughter time. That's good time, and that's important, but it's not the most important thing. You know, it's good to teach your kids how to shoot a basketball and to catch a ball and to hit a ball. And it's good to teach them how to skate and shoot a puck. And it's good to teach them how to cut the grass and do work and work hard. Those are all good things and, in fact, important things for a relation with your children. But it's not the most important thing. See, the most important thing that your children need to see in a dad is a dad who lives for God. So they see how to do that. Because a child that sees their dad living for God, okay, then they know from watching how to deal with that crusty neighbor in a godly way. And then they know how to deal with the overambitious boss who's just causing some stress. And then they know how to love their wives when they're married, or how they should be treated by a man when they get married. They learn what the most important things are. So dads, you got to show up. in the life of your kids. This whole quantity versus quality time myth needs to be destroyed. Because kids don't need so much quality as they need quantity. They just need you around. And certainly, you're not going to waste your time. You're not going to be a couch potato dad. So there is some quality things, but more than anything, your kids just need to see you around. You need to be there for them, spend time with them, and build into their life. You need to be that example so that they can look at you one day and say, that's exactly how it's done. That's exactly what it needs to look like. So dads, this doesn't mean encourage you. We're all busy. We're all working ridiculous hours. We're all commuting longer than we should. But spend time with your kids. Be the example in their life of the most important things. Because we have a lot of dads that are hypocrite dads. We got a lot of dads that say, do this, son, and then they watch their dad do something totally different. I remember growing up in youth group, and one of my friends, his name was Mike, and his parents came to church, and it looked like a fairly good family. I was good friends with Mike. We hung out a lot. We played lots of sports together, did music together. And then one afternoon, we used to get together and play flag football with the dads, sons and the dads. Every Saturday afternoon, we would play flag football or touch. And Mike was there, and I was there, and a bunch of our friends were there, and the dads were there. And we realized that, oh man, Mike's dad's pretty intense here about this little football match. What's going on? This is supposed to be fun. And what happened was there was this play, and Mike's dad was running with the ball, and he decided he would stop and move. But what he didn't realize was there was someone already chasing him down behind, and so when he stopped and moved, there was a bit of a collision, and his dad just went ballistic. Said some things that shouldn't have been said anywhere, let alone a church football game. And Mike, the son, didn't have too many good things to say about his dad for a little while after that. Because his dad had always taught him about sportsmanship, about how to be a good sports athlete for God. But that one moment, he didn't see it. Significantly didn't see it. And he struggled with that example. Where's the example? Where's the example? And for some of us dads today, there has been a collision. We haven't been a great example. So turn it around. Turn it around. And the best way to turn it around is to do this. It's the third thing. Stand up for the truth. Just stand up for the truth. See, it isn't just what you say. It is your example of what you do. But dads, you got to say something. It cannot be your example alone. What is that example built on? What is the foundation? Okay, you're doing certain things and you're showing certain things, but why? Why? Look at Proverbs chapter 4, verse 3 and 4. In Proverbs chapter 4, verse 3 and 4, we know that this is Solomon speaking. Solomon, a son of David. And as much as David had his faults as a father, struggling through fatherhood like we all do, there was something about Solomon that he did right. I don't know why Solomon and why few others. There's something about Solomon. And look at Proverbs chapter 4, verse 3 and 4. Solomon says this, "For I too was a son to my father." Okay, King David was my dad. "Still tender and cherished by my mother." He's remembering as a young boy being in this house. And he says this, "Then he taught me." Okay, my dad taught me. "And he said to me, 'Take hold of my words with all your heart. Keep my commands, and you will live.'" King David in the life of Solomon, even though he had failed with so many of his other boys, there's something about Solomon. And with Solomon, David got at least this part right. David taught Solomon the things that God had taught him. David went to Solomon and said some things. He said, this is what God has said about this. This is what God had says about this season, about this scenario, about this circumstance, about this life choice. David taught Solomon what God had already taught him. And dads, you got to find ways to do that. You have to find ways to do that. And it has to be more than this. It has to be so much more than making sure your kids are in church and at youth group or in kids program. It has to be so much more than that. Because it's great to have a place like this where we can come and be taught and instructed and know our kids are going to be back there now with Sharon and teachers, and they're going to be safe. They're going to hear truth, good things. But it's quite another thing for you to sit your kids down and say, this is what God says about this. This is what God says about this. And that doesn't always have to be planned. It doesn't always have to be, okay, Tuesdays at 6 o'clock in this house is dad Sunday school time, or I don't know how you'd say it, right? And Thursday at 4 after school, this is the time. It doesn't always have to be like that. It can be helpful to have those patterns built into your life. But sometimes even the better way to do that is as things come up, that's the time. As things come up, that's the time to say, this is what God says about that, kids. Because sometimes the best lessons are the ones that aren't planned. In fact, probably 99% of them are. Your kids are dealing with some stuff, and you say, guys, this is what God says about that. This is God's word on that one. I told you a couple weeks ago that I was in the VP office of my kid's school because of a letter I wrote about sex ed curriculum. So that's been quite a discussion in our house. This is about some of these things. I remember driving home just on Friday night from our youngest son, Toby's baseball practice. And it was Toby and Levi and myself in the van. And that came up. There was a lesson taught. And so I turned to my boys and said, what do you think God says about that? What does God say about that? What does His word say? And we had one of the best conversations about what God says about a very key area in their life. Because at that moment, that's what they wanted to talk about. That's what was on their hearts. And so I took advantage of that. And that's not a secret. In fact, in Deuteronomy 6, verse 4, God tells you to do that. He says, impress my word on your heart. That's the first thing. And then he says, and teach them to your kids. Do it when you sit down. Do it when you stand up. Do it when you're around the table. Do it when you're walking down the road. Whenever it comes up and it's time, you just talk about, guys, this is what God says about that. Because you have to teach them some things. As much as you can be a great example and be living this vivid, glorious, godly example for them, they need to know what that's built on. And just watching it is one thing, but seeing the foundation built under their feet is another. You got to do that. You got to build that in their life. And I don't care how old your kids are. I don't care if they're 2 or in their 50s. You're still their dad, and you still do that. The situations get more intense. The scenarios get a little bit more sad sometimes. But if you're a dad, even if your kids aren't at home anymore, that's what you do. Because you're always their dad. And dads, speak up. And you might not be able to discipline your kids like you used to anymore. You can't send them to your room. You can speak up. You can tell them when that's not a good idea. And you can show up in their life. You still do. And you can be an example to them. And show them no matter where they're at in their life, no matter how many kids of their own they have, you can still show them that example. And you can still, because you're a dad, stand up for the truth. and you can continue to teach them the things of God. Because even though you're still their dad, and they're still growing up, we're all still growing up. And there's things that God teaches us every day. He affirms things. He challenges us. He encourages us that we can pass that on to our kids. Dad, does it ever feel like sometimes you're behind enemy lines when it comes to being a father? I feel like that. I certainly do feel like that sometimes. In this country that is becoming less and less pro-family, more and more other things, as a dad, you can feel like a Black Hawk down, and you're just trying to do what you can to survive. So to survive and to keep on, just do those three things. Start there. Speak up, show up, and stand up. And be a dad in the life of your kids. You know, because God, our Father, did all those three things for us. He did all those three things. He disciplines us. He speaks up. In Hebrews 12, verse 5, it teaches us that God disciplines his kids because he loves them. See, a dad that loves his kids disciplines them. And so God does that to us. God disciplines us. There's consequences that he allows us to live out because we messed up. We need to be disciplined for that. God does that. God the Father does that for us. And God the Father was an incredible example to us. He doesn't struggle with this like we all do. He is the perfect dad. He's a good father. And he's shown us this incredible example of love, of what it means to die for your kids because of that love. And God the Father certainly has stood on truth. He's given us that Bible right there, that word. It's all full of truth. It's how he tells us to do life, to not just survive, but to thrive, and to see your kids do the same. So we got to stand on that word right there and continue to build that foundation in the life of your kids, no matter how old, how young they are. You do that as a dad, because our dad did that for us. God, today we thank you for Father's Day. God, we thank you for our fathers. And I know even as I've been speaking this message, man, there's some of us that, man, I didn't have a good dad. I didn't have a good dad. And we feel like one of those prisoners that wouldn't go to Father's Day card club because what are we going to tell our dads? I mean, he didn't show up. He wasn't around. He didn't care. He didn't love me. I know there's some of us now that struggle with that because we just didn't have a good dad. There's some of us today that understand they're at in their life because they did. Much of the reason for why they sit here now is because of their dads. And it was their dads that were that pillar of truth in their life and for their family. God, but no matter where we are at with our dads, our earthly dads, we know that you are the perfect dad. That you are our heavenly Father. And everything we ever need, want, desire, you've fulfilled because you're a good dad. So, Heavenly Father, we thank you. We thank you that you speak up. And when we've made a mistake, you let us know. Thank you for that. Thank you for being a good dad and for loving us enough to do that. Thank you for showing up, being that example in our life of what a good dad is, a dad that cares, loves, gives good gifts, all those things. Thank you for being that example and showing that so faithfully. And God, thank you for standing up, for showing us how to build our life, for showing us the things we need to stand on to live life well, for our families and for our kids. Because yes, it does feel like we are sometimes behind enemy lines. But you are with us and for us. You say you will never leave or forsake. So God, help us to model you in our families and to be the good, good fathers that you are. And I pray that in your name.